you can give to iTunes and all the other, and the Android phones as well. And usually these hosts, they'll give you some reports and they'll tell you where people are listening in the world. And so bizarrely, I've got a lot of people in the Philippines.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is strange, followed by America and then the UK. So you can find that out. But I suppose in terms of the listeners, it is difficult. I mean, maybe this is something we'll talk about, but one thing that I do find very difficult with podcasting is you don't always get so much feedback, and that takes time. And it's actually a reason why a lot of people give up early. If we go back to my earlier podcast in 2012, I gave up about episode 24 for a number of reasons, but one of them was because I didn't think anyone was listening to it. And then I gave up. And then I got a tweet from somebody who said, "Oh, I really love your podcast." I thought, why didn't you tell me that before?
Yeah, people, and even with because what actually helps podcasters is when you leave them reviews on iTunes, because then it gets pushed up through like algorithms, like everything else. So if you find a podcast you like and you leave a review, first of all, the podcast person knows that someone's actually listening, but also it helps other people to find the podcast. Deirdre, you had a question there, I think. How do you name your podcast? I don't think so. I'm not telling you what Orla's podcast is called, but there's no yeah. Do you think there's restrictions on the names? You can call it whatever you like.
I don't think so. I mean, you can. I know with the content of podcasts, you can mark them clean or explicit. So if you do have swearing, or if the content is, I don't know, of a more adult nature, you can mark episodes as explicit. But I don't think there's any.
Yeah, so I was told by a very experienced podcaster that if you have one episode that has swear words in it, your entire podcast gets marked as explicit on iTunes. So if you have a sweary guest and you don't normally have that kind of content, you've just labelled your entire back catalogue as explicit. Have you ever had a podcast that you've recorded that you haven't put out?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
There's a few. So there's one guy, the audio was crackling like way too much. And then I felt really bad that I took 45 minutes of his time out. And then I was like, I'll tell him next week. And this was quite a few months ago and I haven't told him. So, yeah, no, definitely. And then if be braver than me and just tell people, if you're not happy with it, then, don't, because it is a representation of you. But, yeah, certainly. There's been a few that have not gone out.
Ian, have you had any that haven't gone out?
Well, I'm in episode 22, so far no.
Yeah.
And I sometimes have the problem that I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I've deliberately just put them all out. And have they all been great? I mean, no, but I've gone with it. And as I said in my presentation before, the first few of whatever you do, whether it's live video or podcast, they're not going to be that great. But over time, they'll get better and better. But I was procrastinating for about 2 or 3 years before I launched this podcast. So I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for it.
Yeah. Sarah, you've been a guest on my podcast.
Oh, yes.
How would you have felt if I hadn't put it out? No, I'm joking. So as a guest on podcasts, what does it like being on the other side? And do you recommend being a guest on podcasts?
Definitely recommend being a guest. Normally you get invited to talk about your topic of expertise. So it's, you tend to feel confident and comfortable talking about the stuff that you know, and obviously provides value to the audience. I would say try and be careful in understanding the audience or the person, the podcast guest.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily talking to your people. Now you're talking to the people who listen to the podcast. But yeah, it's a great experience. It gives you exposure. So why not?
Excellent. Have we other questions on the floor?
Louise, I'm just wondering from your point of view, if you're putting together a podcast, what is that process and how long does that take before it actually goes live?
For an episode or to launch a whole thing?
No, just for an episode. Yeah.
Well, this is where I let the professional persona fall completely to the ground, because sometimes I literally just stick the microphone in and go. If I am interviewing somebody, I'll research them beforehand. I pick who's coming on, so people that pitch me I'm not interested in, because I know my audience and I know what I want to share with them. But for the solo episodes, I've actually become more professional now, and I do actually write out the bullet points that I want to cover. If I was doing a live video, I would think, right, what are the main things I want to say in this video? I don't write out the whole thing like a script, and it's very much it flows, and I think you can tell that sometimes.
So whatever you say about the show notes, what is that?
So I record the episode, and then I upload it into a website called otter.ai, which I then send to Sarah. So Sarah gets this transcript, and it's quite funny, isn't it, Sarah, what it looks like? Because it's got the Northern Irish interpretation. So I think the more you work with somebody, it's probably easier. Yes. Yeah. So then Sarah turns that into show notes. I then take the recording and upload it into Dropbox to send to my editor. So I work with an editor on the podcast, and he puts the intro and the outro on either side, and he puts it into Libsyn, which is where I host mine, and then that goes out to the different social media or the different podcasting platforms.
And is there a fee to actually list that as a podcast?
Yes, so I pay. That's a good question actually for all of us in terms of much it costs to produce one. So I pay for my amazing show notes writer, I pay for the editor, I pay for Libsyn, and I pay for Zoom that I use to record it. So it's not like a free enterprise.
Well, I mean, you can do it very cheaply. There's Anchor it's an app. I think it's free, so that allows you to do podcasting for free. And it could be just you speaking into your phone. Ideally, get a microphone, and that you could make it really simple that way. But because I'm a perfectionist and I overcomplicate things, of course I don't do that. I pay for my podcasting host. I use one called Captivate FM. It's a relatively new one, and I really like it. So if you're brand new to podcasting, I'd definitely check out Captivate FM. It's about I'm paying about $10 per month, but I think it's got up to $19 per month. So there's that, and then obviously there's the kind of software. So I actually use Skype to bring my guests in, and I use Ecamm Live, and then I actually edit my podcasts myself using what's it called again? Adobe Audition. But if you don't want to do that, which to be quite honest, I don't think you want to. I mean, I enjoy doing it. Then get a podcast editor to do that.
Yeah.
So I use Simplecast to host mine. I can't remember how much that is, and Zencaster to record, and records their end. So I get 2 separate audio files, and that just lands it straight into a Dropbox as well, those recordings. So I find that really kind of helpful, and then send the Dropbox link to the editor. But I like mine quite raw. I don't like to edit too much unless there's like a mistake. So going back to like, if you haven't done this before, going on as a guest, they're normally quite good. And like, if you feel a bit nervous, you can sort of say, oh, it's all right if we do that bit again. And then it's not like, well, unless you get on Ian's, obviously it's not live. And then it can be edited out. And a lot of people edit out the ums and ahs and things like that as well. So you can polish it more or just be raw. So you can spend more money on an editor or just do some basics.
Obviously, Apple is now called, it used to be iTunes, and it's now Apple Podcasts. So that's great for all the iPhone users out there, but you've got to think about the poor Android users as well.
I'm an Android user.
Which I'm still, I've got both because I'm a geek, but so for that, you'd need to think about, there are alternatives. There's Stitcher, there's Google Podcasts. And so most of the podcast hosts that we were talking about, like Simplecast and Captivate, they will actually allow you, make it really easy for you to get it out on all those different platforms. And of course, the other one, Spotify. Spotify is becoming a really big player in the podcasting space.
Yeah. Okay. Question at the back. Yep.
How do you go about growing an audience for a podcast, actually getting people to listen to it? There's so many of them out there. There's like 750,000 podcasts every day. So how do you actually build an audience?
Yeah, well, I think this is where your social media comes into play. What do you want to say there?
I'm really bad at promoting mine, but because mine's literally Ron Seal, like lead generation for financial services. It does what it says on the tin. That if anyone is searching anything to do with that, they find that. And anyone that is in financial services, they want to get leads. So it was quite easy for me when I got it out there.
For me, I think word of mouth helps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. People do talk about it, absolutely. Because if they're investing 45 minutes of their time a week, they won't do that if they don't like it. And they do talk about it, absolutely.
What about you, Ian?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment because I'm still relatively early on. And so certainly word of mouth helps. Having a guest on helps. Not all guests are great at promoting, but sometimes they will do. So that's good. One thing that I'm looking at doing at the moment is doing a giveaway. Now, I hear that giveaways aren't so popular with podcasting as like they used to be, but what I'm going to be doing is giving away some prizes. So again, I've got some relationships with some tool companies in my case. So they've kindly donated some prizes. And there's a website, there's an app called Gleam.io, and they allow you to put on a competition. So in order to enter it, you'll have to do things like subscribe to the podcast or leave a review or follow on Twitter or share it out. And the more you do, the more likely you are to win. And so it's to kind of incentivize the whole process.
One of the big things for me is once Sarah's done her job and the editor's got it out on the website or up on iTunes, is then creating all the social media images to go around it. And I use, when I'm organized, I use Headliner.app to make the wee video with a little clip from the podcast and go out across your social media. But it's not, podcasting is not a quick win. It's a long game. And your audience builds slowly but steadily. And definitely word of mouth. What are you going to say, Sarah?
Yeah, so building on what both Alex and Ian said in their talks earlier, repurposing. So you've created the content in a podcast. To promote it, you can also turn it into a full blog post, which allows more people to find your content, and you can cross-promote your podcast through your blog, through people. Some people read content and they will find the content that way through SEO via your website, find the article, and then go to the podcast and maybe start listening there.
Yeah.
From listening to podcasts yourselves or creating them, what would you say are the main pitfalls or mistakes people make that put people off, stop people listening?
That's a really good question. I'll let you start, Sarah.
As a listener, for me, sometimes going off on a tangent when people start talking about something that's completely irrelevant or a story that doesn't happen often, though, but because most people are completely focused. But yeah, if it goes off on a chat, maybe if it's two guests and they start chatting a lot about things that are not relevant, then I lose interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing, waffling on. So there's been a few podcasts where they've talked about themselves so much, it's all becoming about them. And I find it interesting. I like to know how they do their work in their day and find, but some podcasts that it's just so much about themselves that I feel, well, why am I listening to this? Yeah. So there's a bit of that.
So Youpreneur FM was one of my first podcasts that I adopted, and what I loved about it was Chris would introduce me to all these different people through his interviews, and he's recently just taken a big break, and he's changing up to his all solo episodes now, and I love Chris, he's amazing, but I loved that podcast because of the guests that he was introduced. And now he's changed that. He's done it. So I think like consistency for me, but everyone is different. I'm a creature of habit. Mm-hmm. So I think if you miss like posting for a week or something, if you get people out of those routines, then I've dropped podcasts because I've got out of the routine of listening, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to my guests on the panel.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Social Bee podcast. Come and join us over at www.socialbeeni.com and let's start creating a buzz about your business. And if you like what you hear, please pop over to iTunes and leave me a review. I'd really appreciate it. See you next time.